Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Brought to you by CACI, the Center for American Culture and Ideas. So, Ant, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
One of our listeners who asked to remain anonymous wrote in after our episode on the time value of money and said, what you guys are talking about sounds a lot like the speech partway through It's a Wonderful Life. I've seen bits and pieces of the movie. I haven't seen the whole thing, but I went and looked up this scene, and it's beautiful. Do you know the actor who plays in this?
You know, we talk about this every year at Christmas, and now you're telling me you've never seen it.
Yeah. Do you know the actor who plays in it?
Jimmy Stewart.
Jimmy Stewart. So Jimmy Stewart's character says partway through, and this is in the midst of a bank run, so all the townsfolk have come into the bank and they're demanding their money back. And, you know, of course, they deposited it. They expect that it's in a back room somewhere. And Jimmy Stewart's character, George, says, no, you're thinking of this place all wrong, as if I had the money back in a safe. The money's not here. Your money's in Joe's house, right next to yours, and in the Kennedy house, and Mrs. Macklin's house, and 100 others. You're lending them the money to build, and then they're going to pay it back to you as best they can. Now, what are you going to do? Foreclose on them? And it's just that one paragraph so beautifully sums up what I think people don't understand about banks. We think that we put our money there and the bank pays us something and it loans out money to other people from this endless pot somewhere, when in fact it's simply a middleman. We lend and borrow amongst each other. The bank is simply facilitating that.
I've got something I think a little more interesting. Turns out, and this is from a study in the UK, so you'll have to extrapolate to whatever degree you want or can to get us to, you know, the United States or wherever you happen to live. But it seems to be the case, Ant, that people in a certain generation, I think we're talking very specifically here about millennials, so people who are between 26 and 35 right now, only 19% of them are absolutely certain they want to have children.
Yeah, I've seen references to this. That's really surprising. Well, it's surprising on the one end. It's not surprising on the other when you look at the birth rate. I think the United States now has reached basically zero, or we're 0.5% growth rate.
Yeah, we are growing almost not at all. But these numbers, for people who don't study this sort of thing on a regular basis, these numbers are incredibly low.
Yeah, they really are.
I mean, 19%, that's insane.
I was doing some research on the economies in Florida and Alabama last week, and in both of those cases, their net birth rate is basically zero. Same number of people are being born as are dying, and yet both of their populations have grown over the past year. I think one of them is up 35,000. I can't remember whether it's Florida or Alabama. But if you look at the numbers, that growth in population, which is significant, it's like 2 or 3%, is fueled entirely by people coming into the state from outside.
Yeah, that's right. So people who are leaving, say, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, places with very high taxes, especially at the point of retirement, well, yeah, there you go. It's not happening through anything that we would call a natural process.
Well, I wonder how much of it is due to this thing that the younger generations seem to have been taught all the way back to grade school, which is that humans are somehow a scourge on the planet and we're overpopulated and we need to cut back on our numbers. And yes, it's the case that humans are consumers. We all consume things, but we're also producers. In fact, the typical human produces far more than he or she consumes. And so as you see the population start to top out, the growth rate going to zero, expect the economic growth rate to similarly slow.
The economic growth rate will tank. That goes without saying. I don't think a lot of this has much to do with environmentalist concerns. I really don't. I think a lot of it has to do with something else that people have been taught for a very long time, that you can have it all. You can have a career. You can have children. Well, come to find out, not in a million years you can't have it all. You have to pick and choose what you want. And we've, I think, leaned on people to prefer careers to children, and now they do. And now we're all shocked when they prefer careers to children.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so it goes. I'm rather agnostic on the matter. You make your own choice. I am not invested in the choices of what other people want to do with their own lives. So, save your hate mail for later. I'm not telling women that they need to leave the workforce and have children. I'm the one telling them they should do whatever they want. But don't be surprised when the demographics look very, very different in a generation or so.
Yeah.
Because if these numbers are actually reflective of what people actually think, and that's always an open question. Anyway, that brings us, of course, to the foolishness of the week. And the foolishness of the week this week is right in the middle of your wheelhouse, not mine. My gift was being able to find it, not being able to unpack it. So I'm going to let you have at it, but first I'll tell you what it is, unless you have a guess.
No guesses.
Well, we have a think tank, which is probably enough of a reason to start scratching your head already, but a think tank called the Groundwork Collaborative, which I'm guessing you can imagine what kind of politics they might have. Correct answer? Progressive politics. And if you can have a progressive think tank, which to me seems to be a complete oxymoron, but if you can have that, you shouldn't be terribly shocked to hear what their recent report claims. The headline: half of recent U.S. inflation due to high corporate profits, report finds.
I didn't see it from the think tank, but I've seen several references to that on social media of the problem is corporate profits. It is such complete nonsense. I've got to start at Principles 101 economics to even get to a point that I can explain why it's nonsense.
Well, you do, but let me offer a bit of an analogy. It's akin to somebody saying, the problem with baseball is the shape of footballs.
Right, yeah.
Right, one has absolutely nothing to do with the other. And yet, I would have to take seriously the claim? No, not really. But I guess we have to take this one seriously because the link that we'll put in the show notes comes from The Guardian. But there were plenty of others. This one got a lot of play. So, how on earth do you even start with this?
The problem here is that people see companies earning profit. And I think some of the corporations are showing, particularly the large ones, are showing significant profit. But we've got to remember that 2 years ago, they were showing significant loss. So you got to think about these things in the long term. But people see these companies earning profit and think to themselves, oh, the reason I'm paying more for products is because these companies are earning so much money. Now, that may actually be true.
That could be true.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's not inflation.
But here we get a conflation of a rise in prices or a rise in this price or that price with inflation.
Yeah, exactly. So here's a simple example. Let's take the oil companies and gasoline. If the price of gas goes up and you see the oil companies making more profit and you say, well, the oil companies are responsible for the rising price of gas. And let's just assume for the moment that that's correct, right? But that's not inflation. Inflation is a rise in the average price level. That is, on average, all the prices go up. What happens in this particular case is, yes, the price of gas goes up. Because of that, you've got to spend more money on gas, which means you've got less money to spend on other things, which means there's a surplus of other things. And what does that surplus do? It causes the price of those things to fall. And you've had a change in what we call relative prices. The price of gas went up, prices of other things go down, but the average price of all things consumers buy hasn't changed. The only way to get that to change, the average price of all the things consumers buy, is to have a marked change in the ratio of the money supply to the production of goods and services. Either you've got to dramatically increase the money supply, or you've got to dramatically cut back on production of goods and services. That's what gives you inflation.
And that second thing doesn't typically happen.
No, it typically doesn't.
The former, on the other hand, that happens quite a lot.
Oh, that happens like on a quarterly basis.
That's right. And I want to drive home the point that, Milton Friedman, not one of the lesser lights in the economic universe, right? This is about as big as it gets. Once said, well, often said, actually, that Inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon.
Yeah, and I think he backed off on that statement a little bit later because of the point that you just raised, which is you can get inflation by a decline in economic activity, but again, that tends not to happen that often. And if it does, it's usually because of something dramatic like the 2020 lockdown or a war or something.
It's usually because the communists have come to power.
Right, yeah.
I can safely conclude that really what we're looking at here is a continuation of the politics of envy, which typically during an American election cycle drives us forward.
I think it's partly that. I don't like conspiracy theories, but it's too easy here to say, look, politicians who ultimately are the ones responsible for much of the inflation that you get would be quite happy to be able to foist the blame somewhere else. And so if they can point to the corporations that are making profit and say, well, it's their fault, they're happy to do so. But I'll throw in one more thing. I think there's a psychological effect here. It's very apparent to us when prices rise because it's painful. It's less apparent to us when prices fall. We kind of just accept that as our birthright. Oh, look, I found this thing at 50% off. That's great. And off I go. And a day later, I've forgotten. Furthermore, what one thing is both most affected by price swings throughout the economy and is the one thing that we are very attentive to in terms of price, and that's gasoline, right? Have the smallest bad news occur, price of gas is going to go up, and what happens? We fill up our car, and what are we doing? We're standing there at the pump staring for 3 minutes at the price of gas. And so our tendency is to see prices when they go up and not see them when they go down. And when they go up, we say, oh, that must be inflation, when often it isn't at all. It's simply a change in the relative prices. For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers. One of our listeners, Brandon Pitaccio, wrote and asked, could we do an episode on the surplus theory of labor? My first thought was, we've talked about this before, and I went searching through our episodes, and I realized we hadn't. Now, I'm sure we've touched on it.
I think the closest we have come is the labor theory of value.
Right, yeah.
And these things are deeply related. They're functionally the same thing, probably, but not exactly the same, and we'll come at it from a different direction. And I think we're going to have to talk about value here at some point, but labor factors very prominently into the thoughts of one Karl Marx, if you can refer to what he had as thoughts.
Yeah, and he seemed, from my perspective, and oddly, because I'm the economist, I'm sure you've read far more Karl Marx than I have.
Well, and that would make sense, right? Because it's not economics.
It's not, and that's the weird thing. People have said to me in the past, well, how can you be an economist if you haven't read Karl Marx? It's like saying, how can you be a biologist if you haven't read the Bible? The parallel is very close there.
It's far closer than people might think. And the interesting thing is, okay, I as a political scientist have read a lot more Marx than you have. But I can guarantee you that there are people in the English and sociology departments that have read far more Karl Marx than I have.
Yeah, and the sad thing is they think because they've read it that they understand economics.
That is absolutely correct. You find very few political scientists who are Marxists. You find even fewer economists who are Marxists. I might be able to find 8 or 10 across the entire country.
Well, that's funny because we've wanted to have a Marxist economist on here in the past, and I only know of one. One.
Yeah, no, and he's probably real busy.
He has repeatedly turned down our invitations. Richard Wolff.
Kind of like that pain in the Stephanie Kelton. Well, actually, Stephanie Kelton didn't even bother responding.
Right. But to their credit, Warren Mosler, who is probably more intellectually the father of modern monetary theory than Stephanie, did come on Words and Numbers.
Everything out of his mouth was inscrutable.
I was quite confused at the end of it.
I didn't understand a word he said, and given the hate mail I got from that episode, nobody else did either. I kind of want to stay away from him from here on out.
But let's talk about the surplus theory of labor.
Yeah, what the is that?
Oh, this is where I'm looking at you. You want me to say something?
I do. You're the economist. This episode was your idea. What the is the surplus theory of labor?
My understanding goes like this. You have labor that goes into the production of something. and this something sells for a price. So let's say the thing sells for $10. Then if you've paid your worker, let's say $6, that extra $4, that's surplus value, rightly belongs to the worker. Now, Karl Marx would put a little footnote there and say, well, yes, he understands that the capitalist has machinery and buildings and so forth, and he deserves a fair rate of return on those, although Marx doesn't bother to say what fair rate of return might be. But if you read between the lines, Marx is thinking a relatively small percentage. So let's say $1. So you sell the thing for $10 and $1 goes to the capitalist to pay for the capital. The other $9 rightly belongs to the worker, Marx would say. And if you're only paying the worker $6, there's that surplus of whatever the difference is there, $3, that's been taken from the worker.
The ultimate question, whenever you get into things like this, is who deserves what when you make something.
Yeah.
And Marx is looking for a way to get us all to say, you know what, Karl, that's right. The workers should get the value beyond what we need to have subsistence.
Yeah.
What percentage of anything should they get? And, you know, look, we've decided to let market forces work that out. And he would say, well, market forces are more or less in the hip pocket of the capitalist. He can massage those and get whatever answer he wants. Wouldn't fairness require that the worker get a larger share? We can give the same old argument we always give. Well, the workers are free to engage in a co-op at any time they want. They can start a company and they can do it in their own name. But of course, you see all the difficulties with that. Startup capital is very difficult. Banks don't give startup capital to a bunch of impoverished workers. They give startup capital to people who can cover the losses if losses indeed come. So the capitalist gets all the best of it.
And I think there we trip over what I consider Marx's first problem, in that he draws this line as if it's a bright line between workers and capitalists. And that's not a bright line at all. In fact, well more than 50%, I'd hazard a guess 75% plus of Americans are simultaneously workers and capitalists.
I think you overstate that case by a country mile.
Oh, you think it's more than 75%?
No, I think it's less.
Oh, no. 60% of Americans own stock directly or retirement fund. Yeah.
I would have guessed much lower.
Yeah, it's 60%, may even be plus.
Given my lack of trust in your off-the-cuff remarks, I have just fact-checked you, and you are mostly correct. Here's what we get. 58% of U.S. households own stock.
Okay, and what comes next? Does it say own stock directly?
No.
Okay, just own stock.
And it's up from 53% in 2019.
Yeah.
So we've got an accelerating number.
Yeah.
Now, it's not 58% of Americans, it's 58% of households.
Sure, that's fair.
It's going to be considerably lower than 58% of everyone, if only because we've got, children included.
Right, but by the same token, you'd have to take out children and retirees on both sides of the equation because they're not workers either.
I'm happy to work with this as a shorthand. I just want people to know that we're working with it as a shorthand.
Right. But again, in our conversation right now is an example of this. There's not a bright line between workers and capitalists. And even where you might say there's a bright line, what about the guy who just graduated college? He doesn't own any stocks. He's a worker, right? Or just graduated high school, this sort of thing. But over the person's life, they'll switch from being worker to capitalist and sometimes back in the other direction.
Sure. And the weird thing is that we're going to be able to find people fresh out of school who are making well over $100,000 a year who own nothing.
Yeah.
And we're going to be able to find janitors who are making $32,000 a year who own quite a lot of stock.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's important is both of those groups of people are people. It's so easy, and Marx seems to do this in his writing, cause you to think about capitalists somehow as not humans. It's this capitalist machinery. They're people. They're earning money from various sources. And to say that one set of people deserve priority over the other when it comes to this idea of surplus. For example, Marx says if you sell the product for $10, then $1 should go to the capitalist for fair return, but the rest should go to the worker, because if you only pay the worker $6, that extra $3, the capitalist didn't need that. You've stolen that from the worker. Well, hang on a second. Maybe he's right. The capitalist didn't need that. That's an excess profit. But let's turn to the worker now and apply the same calculus. If the worker can maintain his life, food and some shelter and some clothing for $30,000 a year, then if you pay him $40,000, has he somehow extracted surplus from the properly belong to the capitalist? This is this asymmetry that Marx will perform, that he wants to cut the capitalist down to the bone, but won't do the same thing to the worker, thereby is treating these two groups of people very differently.
It's because he's looking to make an argument about fundamental fairness, right? Who deserves X is what he's asking.
But it seems to me he's put his thumb on the scale of the side of the worker.
Of course he has, and he's put his thumb on the scale on the side of the workers because he thinks, for whatever his reasons, that the worker deserves more than the capitalist does.
Yeah.
Why? The why is because the worker is actually doing the work, and the capitalist isn't, right? The capitalist has money and says, all right, let's start this thing. And for Marx, the people who keep the apparatus of business moving forward, they're not for some reason doing work.
Yeah.
Accountants and lawyers, they're all just kind of skimming off the top. They're not actually doing anything that's valuable in any fundamental way. The same way the guy who had all the money, who invests it, isn't doing anything valuable in any fundamental way. But you can make a pretty clear argument, and I think you should, that if you're doing something that brings products to market, that you are, by definition, very important to the process.
Right. Yes.
And that's something that Marx just never seems to think about. The other thing that's interesting is that Marx, when he wrote, he said that communism was inevitable, that it was simply going to happen, and there was nothing you could do to stop it from happening. And yet here we are, well over 100 years later, and we're further away from communism now in a lot of ways than we were then.
Yeah, very much so.
And if it's going to just happen, then the last thing we all need to do is try to make it happen. I remember writing this in an undergraduate paper. I was this pissed off with Marx, even as an undergraduate, that trying to bring about the communist revolution would be about the same animal as a born-again Christian trying to bring about the end of days.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If it's just going to happen, you don't have to do anything.
Right.
Just sit on your couch and wait. I think quite clearly it's not going to happen.
But you're reminding me of that joke, and I hope I don't screw it up. How many capitalists does it take to screw in a light bulb? And the answer is none. Workers screw in light bulbs. But then the joke goes on. How many workers does it take to screw in a light bulb? And the answer is none. Without capitalists, there aren't light bulbs. And I think this goes to your point. It's so easy to look at the thing and say this thing that was produced, it would not have been produced without labor. Granted, absolutely correct. But we don't go, or at least Marx doesn't go the next step and say, what would have happened if there were no capitalists? Well, if there were no capitalists, the thing wouldn't be created either. When I first started studying Marxism back in my early 20s, I couldn't shake the thought that it seemed that Marx was imagining that capital just fell out of the sky. Or alternatively, that yes, it takes something to build the capital, but once you've built it, it's there forever. And that's not the case. But first off, it depreciates, so you've got to constantly be keeping up with the thing, repairing and maintaining and all of that. But more than that, the capitalist locks his money into the capital. And as long as that capital exists, that capitalist is incurring ongoing risk that that money he's invested might just disappear.
That's so unassailably correct that you wonder how it is people miss it. There's this element of magical thinking that comes along when you start down this road. And it's baffling how people don't get back on the right track. They seem to think that capital falls from the sky. It doesn't work that way. And if you want to see some evidence that it doesn't work that way, go to any communist country.
Yes.
And there goes your proof. we've got perfectly good examples. We've got North Korea, right? We've got China prior to China's becoming authoritarian capitalist in nature rather than communist. Make no mistake, China's not a communist country. It's a capitalist country. They're authoritarian to their bones. Mm-hmm. So you don't get what we would call any kind of justice or property rights. You don't get that there. But you also don't get communism there.
I agree with everything you've said, but people point to China in their huge GDP and say, okay, it's a quasi-communist country, but the fact is its GDP exceeds GDP of the United States, which is correct.
Not per capita.
Yeah, but not on a per capita. On a per capita basis, their GDP is like, what, 1/5, 20% of what ours is?
It's nothing, and here's how you know it's nothing. How many Americans look to move to China, right, and how many Chinese look to move to the United States?
Right, yeah.
I mean, look, this isn't rocket science. Just people vote with their feet. Which way are they moving? Mm-hmm. Right? How many Americans are dying, literally dying, to get to North Korea? How many North Koreans are dying to get to America? Now, there's a different answer. And the rejoinder that you get every single time is, well, that's not real communism. Well, okay, the United States isn't real capitalism.
Right.
Not real capitalism seems to be way better than not real communism.
Yes, and that plays out in the numbers. I repeat this to people all the time, that yes, there's no such thing as real communism, there's no such thing as real capitalism, but the fact is, on average, the closer countries move to the capitalist end of the spectrum, the better off their people are, the less inequality there is, the better the environmental outcomes. All of these things improve the closer you move to that ideal.
And I think when you start to add all of these things up, it looks really clear. What's happening is obvious. When you start looking at the labor theory of value, it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Well, how could it? Everybody knows the labor theory of value is nonsense. How do you know? Because it doesn't matter how long you worked on something. It doesn't matter, right, how much effort you expended to do something. And you and I used to use this example in college classrooms all the time. If you spend 100 hours working on a paper and the person next to you writes hers in an hour and a half, but she's brilliant and you're not, her paper's going to be better than yours.
I'm glad you said that, because when you began this conversation, I wrote down a note here that you're now touching on. And that is that it seems that Marx has this concept that labor is homogeneous. That is, every worker's output is identical to every other worker's output.
In a Marxist society, it's largely correct, and it's extremely low. But broadly and generally speaking, no, the difference in labor is actually quite extreme. And some labor is simply worth more than other labor.
Let me say something in defense of Marx, or at least in an attempt to understand him better.
Here we go.
Is it the case that we can excuse him to an extent because of the time that he lived in when he wrote? And what I mean there is he was writing at a point in history when there was tremendous competition amongst labor for jobs.
Let's go a step further on that point. He's writing at a time when human misery is actually quite high.
I don't know that it was higher than it was prior to that in history. I mean, human misery was always quite high up until about 150 years ago. Nonetheless, he's writing at a point in time when there's tremendous competition in the labor markets. Many workers looking for few jobs, but very little competition on the capitalist side. This was the start of the Industrial Revolution.
That's right.
Is it possible that what he was seeing when he saw very low wages amongst the workers and high profits amongst the capitalists was simply a result of that particular point in time? That if he had been born 50 years later, when the capitalist side had evolved much more and there was much more competition and therefore less profit, he would have come to a different conclusion.
I think that's right. But look, we're all children of our own time.
Yeah.
You and I draw conclusions all the time on matters that 100 years from now, people will say, well, you know, they didn't know this, they didn't know that. All right, well, how could we have? We know what we know.
Right.
So too, Marx knew what he knew. And look, what he didn't realize was that as bad as things were at that moment, they were actually getting better.
Yes.
He framed is questions in terms of ought. just factual questions he would look at, and he would overlay a normative argument. Workers have to work X hours a day. That was just simply true. And then he would come in and say, well, workers shouldn't have to work X hours a day. Now that's different. That's a different kind of argument, right? I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong. And look, history bears them out. We think that workers should have a pretty soft life. Well, what do they have now? A pretty soft life.
Yeah.
A lot of the things that he wanted have come to pass. The means by which he thought they would come to pass did not come to pass at all.
Right. Oddly, they came to pass because of the very thing that he was railing against, capitalism.
That's right. When I was coming up as an undergraduate, I would have professors who were broadly sympathetic to Marx, not Marxists, but broadly sympathetic. And they would say, look, Marx got a lot of things right. What did he get wrong? And they would say things like, well, he didn't understand the self-corrective mechanisms that capitalist society would have, things like welfare and what have you. And look, I've often said that it's my firm belief that welfare is money we give to the poor to buy them off. That's kind of a Marxian way of understanding welfare, isn't it? Notice what I don't say, that welfare is a way that we make people's lives better.
Yep.
It's a way that we buy them off. But then, I had other professors who said Marx was so wrong about everything. The interesting question is to ask what he got right. I don't know that he got much right at the end of the day. I think he misses the mark on human nature, on human motivation, on why people do the things they do. And it's generally because they want things. They want to be able to afford things, right? They work so they can have money, et cetera, et cetera. Things that almost everybody would say, well, yeah, of course. Well, he didn't see it that way. And when you really think about things, what about what things are actually worth, right? Because Marx is talking about things like a place to live and food to eat. What's he not talking about? Collector's baseball cards.
Yes, right. Or the latest PS whatever.
The PS5, which, if anybody out there has an extra one, I could sure use it. Send it on over. I've been wanting a PS5 for quite a while, but here's the thing. They're actually quite expensive, and I don't have $500 to throw at a PS5. What am I actually saying? I'm saying a PS5 isn't worth $500. Value is subjective, because somebody who makes half what I make, who owns a PS5, will say, no, it's absolutely worth it. See, I have one right here. There's your proof. And here's where everything gets very muddy. What's anything worth? And things are worth only, and I mean only, what other people will pay for them.
And that includes labor. Not people, but labor.
That is correct. And how do we determine what I, for example, might pay for labor? The labor market.
Yeah.
People go and they try to sell their labor. And if I can buy a person's labor for $20 an hour, I'm not paying $50. And if I can buy it for $5, I'm not paying $6.
And anybody who disagrees with this, I ask you how many people you hire to do your dishes and to mow your lawn, to make your bed in the morning, and the answer is 0. Why? Because you have decided it isn't worth it to you to hire labor like that.
It very much is worth it to other people. That's why we have housekeepers.
Yeah.
It's worth it to other people, or that category would be non-existent. So everything gets situated into this great big poem about everything, and there's no way to separate one little part of it out. When you say workers should, well, what you're really saying is everybody else should value something differently than they actually do.
Yes. Or more specifically, they should value it the same way I do.
Which is what Marx was saying.
Yeah.
He was saying, I know what things are worth and you don't. And yet, when you step back and you look at a market determining what things are worth, you get very clear answers about literally what everybody thinks things are worth. This is why you'll pay more for an Acura than you'll pay for a Honda. You'll pay more for a Honda than you'll pay for a Mazda. And you'll pay more for a Mazda than you'll pay for a Kia. Because people have decided that that's what they're willing to pay for these things. And they don't decide those things in a vacuum. There's all kinds of evidence that goes into it. And when you're looking at labor, the labor has to save you more than it costs you. That's the calculus that people use with labor. So if my time is worth $20 an hour, but I'm spending 5 hours of my week doing $10 an hour work, I'm better off hiring somebody to do those hours so I can then switch my attention to do the $20 an hour work.
Right.
But if I can't do that, then it's just simply a matter of convenience, and maybe I can't do it at all. So too, when I own a sandwich shop, and I can hire somebody to make sandwiches for $10 an hour, but then I end up making $14 an hour for every hour that person works. It's absolutely worth it for me to hire that person. If, on the other hand, I make $8 an hour after hiring that person for 10, that person's got to go because he's literally costing me money.
And there you bump up against what I think is the devastating argument against the Marxist view. And that is, if you, Mr. Worker who's making the sandwiches, feel that the employer has confiscated some of your wages, some of your value, then I challenge you, go out and start your own sandwich shop.
Or more likely, go find a different sandwich shop and offer your labor to that owner.
Yes, that. But, if you think that the capitalists are exploiting the workers, become a capitalist and, then you can exploit somebody. And the fact is you won't. Why won't you? Because you value things differently than the capitalist does.
I say that too, but I want to admit that that's a little flippant.
Do you think so?
I do, because a typical worker at a sandwich shop has absolutely no chance of starting his own sandwich shop anytime soon. Right? It's a costly endeavor, and it takes quite a lot. But there's nothing to stop that person from finding a second sandwich shop and seeing if his labor is worth more on the open market.
Yeah, but see, I don't disagree with you. Yes, it's a huge, heavy lift to go and start your own sandwich shop. But somehow the worker can see, yeah, that's a heavy lift. You shouldn't expect that of me. But he's not willing to make that jump and say, but wait a minute, the guy I'm working for did exactly that lift.
That's right. And I think people often don't make that last step.
Yeah.
I think they should, because it really is quite a lift, as you put it. To take that much capital, wrap it up in a speculative venture, say, I think I can make sandwiches that people will want and still turn a profit, even after putting all of this capital at risk. I think people look at that and they, for whatever their reason, they just don't think it's that hard. I think it's the same argument, more or less, that we make about CEOs, right? People look at CEOs and think they can do it. And they think if they had $1 million, they could start a successful business. I think if many of them had $1 million, they'd lose $1 million.
It's the observation bias. They look at the business owner and they think, I could do that, because they're only seeing the business owners who were successful. They don't see the ones who lost their shirts. Because why? They've gone on to work for somebody else. They look like workers.
Right. And look, in the end, when you think about Marx, my second group of professors question is the right one. What did he get right?
What did he get right?
Not much. I think if you really peel back the layers, what he got absolutely right and what he illustrated himself was the enviousness of human beings. He wanted to be important, and yet he didn't have the skills, gifts, abilities, or drive, frankly, to be all that important. He never knew the success that he ended up experiencing, undeservedly so, I think. But that's for you to decide out there in listener land. He was a bit of a leech. If it weren't for ankles, we would never have even heard of Marx. He was living off the fat of somebody else's land, neglecting his own family. I mean, this was not a good person. And yet we look at him as the moral guide, right? The moral North Star for society. And yet every place that's ever tried to put his perspective into practice has failed so utterly that people starved to death.
It's funny you say this, because as you're talking about this, I'm thinking back to Henry David Thoreau. on Walden Pond. Of course, he goes out to Walden Pond. He's going to live a life of self-subsistence and back to nature, all this stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
And I was actually there at Walden Pond and was speaking to some people who have lived there, their families for generations. And they kind of laughed and they said, yeah, but the story that doesn't get told is that the only reason Henry David Thoreau survived is because he leached off of the neighbors. He needs some extra firewood or, some food or whatever it is. And the community kind of supported this guy as an oddity.
That's right. He went out to the woods to live deliberately.
Yeah.
And then didn't.
Yeah.
That's generally how these things go. When we think about self-sufficiency, we always think about self-sufficiency in the context defined by other people. And society is really what we're thinking about. And Marx thought he could remake society. Well, there are those among us, I think both of us included, who think society is a natural emergent phenomenon and that you cannot remake it. It simply is what it is. And it will become exactly what it will become no matter what you try to do. And this is the argument we use by saying, look, there are so many unintended consequences every time you try to control people that you shouldn't even bother. Well, the same holds true here. It's the exact same argument. It's just that Marx would control people even more. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.